To be here. It's been a while since I've talked in person to people. So as Nathan mentioned, I am a social psychologist by training, and a lot of my work deals with communication and conflict. One of the things I'm particularly interested in is how can we have thoughtful, engaged discussions with people when our values, our attitudes, and even our beliefs fundamentally about what's true and what's false are in conflict. And so I was doing that kind of work for about a decade and a half when all of a sudden one of our most hotly contested political topics became a topic that I think of as a matter of basic scientific fact, which is, should you get vaccinated against a deadly virus? And so given the type of work we were doing in my lab, I thought, you know, maybe there is something useful we can do here to contribute to this conversation. Now, one of the sort of fundamental ideas that we work with is the idea that when people disagree with each other and engage with each other's points of view, there are multiple goals that they might be pursuing in that conversation. So one obvious goal is attitude change and persuasion, right? Convincing the other person that they're wrong. But you could also imagine that people engage in these conversations because they want to simply express themselves. They want to explain why they believe what they believe. They might be interested in learning about their counterpart, either because they're genuinely curious or because they want to maintain their relationship and they want to make the other person feel heard. They might want to de-escalate conflict. They might be working on some other external set of joint goals, and pursuing those goals requires being able to communicate about this focal disagreement, right? It turns out that when you ask people about their goals in conflict, they are readily aware of the rich constellation of goals they themselves have, right? So people recognize that when they talk to disagreeing others, they want to persuade, but also want to learn. The problem is they think that the people on the other side, the disagreeing others, are only there to persuade. Right, so I am a complex, sophisticated person. I have multiple goals, but you're a jerk, and you're going to push your ideas on me, okay? And so this poses a challenge because if people are going into conversations expecting their counterparts to be argumentative, how do we actually get them to have better, more engaged conversations? One of the tools that we have been working on in my lab is a style of communication that we call conversational receptiveness. So the idea behind conversational receptiveness is that you can use language very explicitly to communicate that you're engaging with the other point of view. We define conversational receptiveness in terms of specific words and phrases. So in other words, it's not a mindset, right? It's not sort of a general characterization of how you're talking. It is the use of very specific linguistic cues. And in our prior research, what we found is that conversational receptiveness strongly predicts conflict outcomes. So when we pair people up to talk about hot-button topics in American politics, people who are seen as being more receptive are also seen as having better judgment, as being more trustworthy, as being more reasonable. Their counterparts want to engage with them in the future. Okay, so what I want to do today is I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what conversational receptiveness is, how we came up with it, and then I'm going to show you a short series of studies where we are starting to use this toolkit to help people have better conversations around COVID-19 vaccines. Okay, so how did we come up with conversational receptiveness? The question is, what can people do in communication to show their counterpart that they're thoughtfully engaged with their point of view? And so what we did here is leverage natural language processing in order to identify specific linguistic markers of engagement. I am not a computational linguist, so I have learned to explain this to other not computational linguists. This will be the simplest explanation of NLP you have ever heard in your life. Okay, so there's 3 steps. The first thing we do is we collect a large body of conversations between people online who disagree with each other about a hot button topic. We retain the transcripts of those conversations, and then we show them to a separate sample of participants, a much, much larger sample of participants, and we ask those people to read the transcript and say, the person who you disagree with in this conversation, how engaged were they with their counterpart's perspective, right? Were they receptive to what they were hearing or not? And then step 3 is we write a machine learning model that basically correlates specific words and phrases used in the transcripts with the ratings of receptiveness in the second step. Okay? In the second step, we end up with about 5 ratings for each conversation. There's good inter-rater reliability, so that's sort of our ground truth for training the model. I recognize that this all still sounds like super abstract, so we're going to play my favorite game called Pretend You're an Algorithm. Here's how this is going to go. I'm going to show you 2 pieces of text. These are pieces of text from our study where people responded to a claim that they disagreed with. The claim is about the Black Lives Matter movement. Both respondents don't agree with the original writer, and they agree with each other. Okay, so they're expressing basically the same attitude, but very, very differently. And what I want you to think about is which one of these pieces of text would be rated as more receptive by our algorithm. Okay, so here we go. All right, we're going to take a vote. So who thinks the first one is the more receptive one? Okay, second one, for the sake of democracy? Nope. Okay, so you guys are even better at this than usual. Normally we have like 85 to 90% consensus. Here we have universal consensus. Everybody kind of agrees that it's the first one. And these are completely cherry-picked to make your life easy. So the first one is one of the most receptive pieces of text in our data, and the second one is one of the least receptive pieces of text in our data. And you can look at them and like you get the flavor, right? You're like, oh yeah, it feels different. But then if you were to teach somebody else how to talk the first way and not the second way, that's harder. It's harder to be really precise about it. And so this is where the algorithm comes in. What the algorithm does is it takes a list of text features, which is what's on the y-axis here, and it gives us the frequency with which they're used. And then we could look at text that was rated as less receptive versus more receptive by human raters and see which features of text make the difference, okay? So the data overall would look like this for a large data set. And for the 2 pieces of text I just showed you, they are differentiated by these 5 features, okay? So negation is things like can, don't, won't, no. Reasoning is something that academics just love. However, although, because, and therefore sounds super smart, but also super condescending. Acknowledgement does a lot of work for us. So acknowledgement is using your own words to demonstrate that you've heard your counterpart. So it's things like, I understand that, or you are saying X, Y, Z. Hedges are words that allow you to hedge your claims. So things like sometimes, however, probably, possibly, okay? And finally, agreement is finding areas of agreement even in the midst of disagreement. So saying things like, I understand that the last 2 years have been hard on everyone, and we both want blah, 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 okay? Yeah, Tali.
So is acknowledgement the same as paraphrasing, or where would you put paraphrasing in?
Yeah, so acknowledgement is very, right. So what we are, yes, conceptually, absolutely. Because we are using a language processing algorithm, we want specific words that we can pick out of text, right? So what you call kind of that cluster of words, you know, we can call it anything, but the idea is to repeat essentially what the other person said. So paraphrasing is a totally reasonable name for it. Yeah?
So does it matter to you if it's a strategic use of these rhetorical devices, or is it genuine receptiveness? Does it matter?
Well, it matters, but it depends what it matters for.
To you?
To me as a researcher, it matters a great deal because it's an interesting question. In the practical sense, I think there are lots of situations in the world that can be improved with some strategic receptiveness, right? I often think about it in a similar way to how we think about want-should conflict, right? If you ask most people about their intentions and conflict, they want to have productive conversations. They want to de-escalate. They want to know where the other person is coming from. But in the moment, they sort of lose their good intentions and end up in a screaming match. So one way to think about strategic receptiveness is giving people the toolkit to live up to their good intentions, right? You can also, of course, think of it as people being completely manipulative, not having any good intentions at all. But I think that's the minority of cases. All right, I'm going to zoom along. Okay, so we have our markers of receptiveness, and just to get back to our little example here, you can see what the algorithm would have actually flagged in those two pieces of text, right? So I understand is acknowledgement, probably is a hedge. I can also see as agreement. I agree is agreement, but possibly sometimes is a hedge, right? Whereas the other one, do not, can't, are both negations, and therefore because and because are reasoning words, right? So these two pieces of text are very different from each other because they almost have no overlapping features. So what I want to do now very briefly is show you a set of studies where we use this toolkit to try to improve conversations about the COVID-19 vaccines. But before we quite get there, I think it's also useful to think about goals again. Right? You can say that in conversations about politics, having civic discourse with civil disagreement is a reasonable goal, right? We should be able to talk about opposing views without screaming at each other. But when you talk about vaccines, you might say, look, this is a matter of fact and science. One person is right and one person is wrong, and the only goal should be to persuade the person who is wrong to not be wrong anymore. I'm going to push back on that a little bit and say, no, even these conversations have multiple goals, right? So certainly there's the changing beliefs and changing behavior goal, but there's also a very important goal of maintaining patient trust in their provider and maintaining patient trust in science more broadly. There's an important goal of saving time, right? Most physicians have 8 to 12 minutes per patient, right? And they can't spend an hour convincing each person to get vaccinated. There's an important goal of decreasing provider stress because these are very, very hard conversations. And there's an important goal of maintaining the ongoing clinical relationship, right? So if you tell a person to get vaccinated and they don't want to get vaccinated, are they then less likely to come back to you when they have a funny mole because they don't want to have the same awkward conversation about getting vaccinated again, right? And so that's really what we're trying to go after, is improving the quality of the conversation. Okay, so real quick, 4 studies. Okay, so study 1 was sort of our first foray into this space. And what we do is we recruit vaccine hesitant participants online. And we asked them to read a scenario about a town hall meeting. So this is, imagine like a year ago when vaccines are first available and there's lots of Q&A sessions about where you get the vaccine and what happens when you get the vaccine, and this is sort of a common thing people are living through. In this scenario, there's a person who expresses vaccine hesitancy, and then there's a doctor that responds, and we manipulate the doctor's response to include markers of receptiveness or not. Vaccine hesitant person, I apologize for the very small font here, but basically this person says, look, this whole thing has been done too fast. I don't trust big pharma. Who knows what these vaccines will really do to my body in the long run? My immunity is good. Leave me alone. The doctor then says one of two things. So the persuasive doctor gives them every fact in the world. Right? The clinical trials were really big, like all the governments in the world are supervising them, COVID is deadly, every good argument you can think of, which is why it's so long. The receptive doctor says the exact same thing, but we kind of sandwich it between two receptive paragraphs. So there is some positive affect, thank you for raising this point. There's some acknowledgement, I understand that you're concerned about the safety, right? There's some agreement, we both want to get back to normal as quickly as possible, okay?
Is this persuasive or informational? I mean, I was just trying to think, is there a distinction?
Persuasive or informational? So I would say, I think of persuasive as being the goal, right? Like, is your goal persuasion? And informational is a distinction between how you get to that goal, right? So you could imagine accomplishing persuasion through kind of an informational channel, right? Or more like a, system one channel. In this case, it sort of doesn't matter, right? What we're always doing is we're taking one condition where there is arguments that people make based on facts and evidence, and then a second condition where we add receptiveness. Okay, so what we get is vaccine hesitant participants evaluating the doctor more positively. The things that do the most work for us here is evaluations of how reasonable the doctor is and how trustworthy the doctor is. But overall, we get this sort of pattern of, a boost to the evaluations of the persuader. Let me go on because I just got the 5-minute sign, and I'm only study 1. So in study 2, what we're doing is we're saying, can other people do this, right? We wrote the doctor messages. Can we let normal people do this? So same deal. We recruit pro and anti-vaccine participants, and we randomly assign the pro-vaccine participants to either make their best argument or use conversational receptiveness. Make your best argument looks like this. You're going to see a message from a person who is vaccine hesitant. Write your best argument as if you would if you encountered them in real life. And then the receptive instructions is the same thing, but we give them literally one screen of text on markers of receptiveness, right? And so from everything the algorithm that the algorithm spits out, we pick out 4 markers of receptiveness that explain the most variance in our prior data. And so we tell them to use positive statements, acknowledgement, hedges, and look for points of agreement. So, they probably spend 2 minutes on this page, and then they write their response. And so again, what we see is that the vaccine hesitant participants see the writer as more reasonable and more trustworthy when they get this itty bitty receptiveness training. And then interestingly, the writer now has more positive views of the vaccine hesitant person, right? So to some extent, there's some self-persuasion going on where once they think about the extent to which they agree and find, sort of have to acknowledge the other person's point of view, they're like, oh, this person is not as crazy as I thought they were, right? Which leads to sort of a positive spiral in the conversation overall. Okay, study 3, we tried to build this out a little bit to more rounds of conversation, right? Remember that in study 1 and study 2, we used that same spiel about why the person is vaccine hesitant. In study 3, what we do is we get the vaccine hesitant people to actually write out their reasons. So now you have vaccine hesitant participants, each of whom writes a paragraph about why they're vaccine hesitant. They get a response from a pro-vaccine person, and then they evaluate that person and their response. Okay, so now we're kind of stimuli sampling on both sides of this thing. Here are our evaluations, again, of the pro-vaccine responders. Again, higher ratings of reasonableness and trustworthiness. And then we add this DV about, do you want to get this person's opinion on another topic? Okay, and so the answer is yes. So this is like, in my head, the person coming back to the doctor to ask about their mole, even if they don't want to get vaccinated. And then we get this sort of very unfortunate decrease in willingness to vaccinate in both conditions. And what happens there is this is when Johnson & Johnson announced the blood clots. So literally, we launched the study. Turns out people are getting blood clots. It's all over the news. This is what we get. And then, again, flip of the conversation, the people who are pro-vaccine, again, see the vaccine-hesitant person more positively after having written to them in this conversational style. Okay. Oh, one last set of DVs here. We wanted to know if this was hard for people. We wanted to know if writing in this way was hard for people. And so what we see is absolutely no difference in how difficult it is. Not surprising, right? And some recognition that maybe this is a good idea, so they're more willing to use it in the future than the people who are using their own natural conversation style. Okay, the last study, this was god-awful hard and god-awful expensive, because what we did is we recruited vaccine-hesitant people and pro-vaccine people, and we put them in a chat room at the same time to actually have a live conversation about vaccines. The design is very, very similar, except that we add a third untreated control group of vaccine-hesitant people, and we ask that control group to imagine what it would be like to have this conversation. Because we want a baseline of how do people feel about these conversations without actually receiving messages that are either persuasive or receptive. Okay, so we have 3 categories of vaccine-hesitant participants. The other thing that we do in this study that's really important is we're trying to get closer to sort of actual behavior with regard to vaccine uptake. And so we designed a click-through measure where at the end of the study, we offer them 4 websites that have accurate vaccine information. And we say, thank you for participating. Would you like to be forwarded to these websites? Okay, and so what we want to see is, does our intervention increase people's willingness to take up accurate, truthful information about the COVID-19 vaccines? So this is our previous DVs. What you see is that conversational receptiveness, again, helps with perceptions of reasonable trustworthiness and willingness to take somebody's opinion. What I want you to notice about the dark orange bars that are so very different from the other bars, that's the untreated control. And so what's interesting is that when people imagine these conversations without having had them, they imagine pro-vax people to be a lot less reasonable, a lot less trustworthy. They have no interest in their advice, and they think the conversation is going to be very unpleasant. Okay, so part of what's happening here is that there's a big effective forecasting error, right? Perhaps the biggest result of this whole line of research is that we just need to be having more of these conversations because they're not nearly as bad as we expect them to be. And then finally, here is our click-through data. It is a teeny tiny effect, but it is significant. People who use conversational receptiveness get their counterparts to click through to accurate vaccine information at a higher rate than our untreated control, okay? So where all of this is going, I realize I'm completely out of time, is that we think we have a toolkit that would be useful in these types of interactions that will help doctors have better conversations with very, very little effort and no additional time. We are rolling this out in a variety of experiments in the field where we can actually measure vaccine uptake. We are attempting it with reductions in antibiotic use. I think this is promising, and I'm very happy to talk to anybody about it afterwards offline.